Hello everyone, a very warm welcome to all of you on Unacademy. I'm Prashasti Arora and today we will be discussing the phases of Indian foreign policy. We know that 2021 is an important and a very crucial year for India's active, proactive democracy, foreign policy. And in fact, in that regard, we will see the trajectory. We'll see that Indian foreign policy that has emerged from the colonial times to the 21st century. So let's have a look at this entire trajectory of the Indian foreign policy. A little bit about myself self before we start the session. I've done journalism and I enjoy delving deep into current affairs and current events. You can subscribe to the Core Sevi channel. जो कोर सेवी का यूट्यूब चैनल है उसको सब्सक्राइब करना मत भूलिएगा because that is where I also do a summarized series of modern Indian history, and in fact I also cover a lot of topics and MCQs on the special classes that is there on the Unacademy platform. So please use the name Prashasti Arora and follow me. And you can now avail a 10% additional discount on the Unacademy subscription by using the code PRAS10. In fact, now you can follow me on my Telegram channel to get access to my schedule of the classes and, of course, the study material that I provide. My Telegram channel link is this. Please do subscribe to it right away. Now, before we go ahead with the session, a little bit about the iconic price hike. Iconic price hike is coming up very soon. So please do upgrade from the plus subscription to the iconic one and get benefits like a personal coach. There'll be a mains test series with an evaluation. There'll be customization of your study planner. There'll be booster sessions. There'll be workshops, answer writing daily that will help you fine tune your preparations. Also, new batches for UPSC CSC 2021, 2022, and 2023 aspirants is finally starting on the 11th of January. So please do enroll for the same which you think is best suitable for you. There'll be prelim syllabus coverage. There'll be PDF study material. There'll be educators, top educators on one platform. There'll be dedicated doubt clearing sessions. There'll be interview preparations, and of course prelims test series with analysis. So please do enroll for the batch you think is best suitable for you. Mission 2021, Mission 2022, Mission 2023. Then there is Lux 2021, Lux 2022, Lux 2023, and there is Expedition 2021, 2022, and 2023. Now, also, you can get the combo offer of plus and iconic at a subsidized rate for 1 year and 2 years. So please do avail that discount and use the code PRAS10 for an additional 10% discount. Now, okay, let's start with the lesson. Before we start with the Indian foreign policy, right now we have to understand from how exactly did it evolve and emerge. So it is of course important to understand the foreign policy objectives of the Indian National Congress during the period of colonial times. Now, the objectives of the colonial government, including the East India Company, English East India Company, were to safeguard the frontiers of India in the northwestern frontier province, that is the Afghanistan border. Now, of course, there were a lot of threats at that time. In fact, there were a lot of Soviet threats that were emerging at that point. And in fact, the main objective, in fact, talking in totality about foreign diplomacy, the main objective of foreign diplomacy, in especially talking about Indian foreign diplomacy, is that the nation's interest will be of paramount importance, right? And it was also in fact important at that time, getting back to colonial period, it was also important to safeguard the frontiers with respect to Tibet and China. Now, many efforts were taken by the British, and the representatives from China met in 1913 in Shimla and agreed to delineate the border. Now, this particular line is called the McMahon line. You can see it right here. This is the McMahon line, and the colonial government in fact used Indian resources to invade Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, and Burma again, amongst other nations. In fact, मैंने पूरा colonial school of thought, nationalist school of thought, सारा major approaches of Indian modern history में cover किया हुआ है. So please do subscribe to Coursera. Now, remember that colonial governments' appetite of using Indian resources could never really be satisfied in that, and in that regard, Indian armed forces was also used to execute these objectives of the colonial government. Now, in fact, it was one of the earlier objectives of the moderates in the Indian National Congress to prevent the Indian resources from being used for colonial expansion. So, of course, Indian National Congress realized that Indian resources were being used for only colonial expansions, and in that regard one of the objectives was to ensure that they are not being used for colonial expansions. Now, of course, in the later period of the Indian National Congress, Jawaharlal Nehru addressed the Congress of oppressed nationalists in Belgaum in 1928, and we can see that supporting anti-colonial struggles elsewhere in the world became a very, very important aim of the Indian National Congress. So this was a little about the colonial, foreign policy in colonial times. Now a little more about that. Gandhian school of thought and of course principles have continued to inspire the people of Sri Lanka, Poland, and other African nations who who really wanted to chuck the yoke of colonialism and be liberated from the shackles of colonialism. Now, it was the nationalist movement that actually helped evolve the principles of foreign policy, which included democracy, rule of law, in fact, also peace and the policy against. Discrimination and discrimination that was based on color. Of course, these principles, some of these principles, Gandhian principles, and principles of foreign policy at that time also continued to dominate, continue to dominate foreign policy even now. So which is why understanding foreign policy at that time was is also very, very important. Now, talking about independent Indian foreign policy, please remember that Indian foreign policy from the time of independence can be categorized into six different periods with different strategic interest. Now, who was it given by? It was given by our External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Shankar. According to him, there are six different phases of the foreign policy. Now, which is the first one? The first one is era of optimistic non-alignment. It was between 1946 to 62. In fact, India began on the front foot just when it was about to achieve its independence. As a first initiative, the Asian Relations Conference was organized in 1946. In fact, from the beginning, India has emerged as a voice for the underdeveloped and the developing nations of especially the global south. Now, this soon metamorphosized into the creation of non-aligned alignment movement, and the nations met in Belgrade in Siberia in 1961. Now, remember that non-alignment is not just a policy of non-intervention; it is in fact misunderstood to be a policy of non-intervention or neutrality, but it was a policy of not joining the two Cold War camps that emerged at that point, the Western world, or the USSR led Warsaw Pact. These were the two Cold War camps that emerged, but non-alignment is always misunderstood to be as something that is nations that are neutral, but in reality it was a policy of not joining either of these Cold War camps. In fact, it meant providing issue based support to these nations on which the nations belonging to the NAM could benefit from. Now, in fact, India's scientific endeavors were achieved with the help of USSR, whereas its agricultural needs were done with a little bit of assistance by the United States. So this was about the non-alignment, the optimistic non-alignment phase. Now, during this phase, India also pursued a very, very active policy to solve some of the global issues that were emerging, and it was done under the United Nations. In fact, India played a very, very important role in the Korean Peninsula Congo, Indochina region, among other nations. In fact, Shashi Tharoor describes this first phase of independent Indian foreign policy as the one that involved idealism in the policy. In fact, this period soon ended with the Chinese handing over a humiliating defeat to the Indians in the Sino-Indian War that happened in 1962. In fact, India was rudely shaken up after this particular war. Now, after this, the second important phase of policy, the second phase of Indian foreign policy is the era of realism and discovery. This was between 1962 to 70. In fact, the 1962 Sino-Indian War jolted the nation out of its fetish of idealism. So, in fact, this war really showed us the realities, and got India to understand how realism really needs to be incorporated in Indian foreign policy. In fact, India during the next 8 years began a period of embracing realism and began to discover its strengths and of course also the weaknesses. Now during this phase it continued to lead the NAM grouping and also embraced Afro Asian solidarity. In fact, it woke up to the truth of China and the illusion of Sino Indian friendship, or the Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai. Now, China was, of course, an imperialist power and it had to be tackled with all, means and ways. And another major headache that brought the focus back on the neighbor was Pakistan. And relations with Pakistan had started to get, worse to a great extent during the second phase of the Indian foreign policy. The Pakistanis under Field Marshal Ayub Khan wanted to take advantage of the losses suffered by the Indian army, and it was in this regard that led to the 1965 war between the two nations. In fact, Pakistan and China also united and further attempted to weaken India. In fact, the relations with the US also had deteriorated because of the tenure, because that time President John F. Kennedy was the president, and things weren't going down very well with the president of the US at that point. In fact, the US initiated that India join the US, but India, of course, refused, and the US, because of this, denied food aid to India. Now, the economic situation was also suffering with the stagnant agriculture, and in that regard, Green Revolution was launched. In fact, massive, inflation eroded the confidence in the Indian rupee, and overall, these 8 years, which saw three prime ministers, was an era where realism returned, and India actually started to realize its friends and enemies that were there in the foreign policy. Now, talking about the third phase, that was the era of regional assertion between 1971 to 1991. The next 20 years saw India emerge as a regional power within South Asia. In fact, it began with a victory against Pakistan in the 1971 war, wherein Bangladesh was created out of East Pakistan. Now, of course, India also asserted its regional influence in the Tamil Civil War in Sri Lanka, and relations with Pakistan later began to improve under the leadership of the Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. Now, the former Prime Minister also visited in China and the United States, and worked out the modalities of a working relationship between both the nations. Now, in fact, India emerged as a regional power in the conduct of its diplomacy. It also had to tackle its fair share of problems, including a downturn in the relationship with Bangladesh and Nepal. In that regard, even Operation Cactus that was conducted in Maldives, strengthened India's position when it intervened and defeated terrorists belonging to a Tamil terrorist group who had taken over Maldives. Now, the fourth important, foreign policy, Indian foreign policy phase was the quest for strategic autonomy. That was between 1991 to 1999. In fact, the collapse of the USSR in 1991 dealt a huge blow to the aspirations of the Indian foreign policy. The USSR, in fact, acted as a guiding force of India from the 1960s, and that collapse once again brought forth the quest for strategic autonomy. Now, in fact, India did improve its relationship with the US with the visit of Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, but ties remained very, very frosty even then. Now, in fact, this also provided an opportunity for India to improve its ties with the US allies such as Japan, South Korea, Australia, European Union, ASEAN, and Israel. In fact, amidst all of this, it was important for India to maintain its strategic autonomy. Now, despite massive international pressure, the government headed by Atal Bihari Vajpayee had conducted the Pokhran nuclear test in 1998. Now, in fact, many nations such as Australia, Japan, and the United States sanctioned India in this regard. In fact, India bravely fought off all these attempts to crush its independence and successfully maintained its strategic autonomy. It, in fact, sought to build relations with all nations on the basis of mutual respect. Now, talking about the fifth phase, that is the balancing power between 2000 to 2013. The 21st century, of course, began with the signing of the Indo Russia Special and Privileged Relationship Treaty 2000. It was all around this same time when US President Bill Clinton visited India and improved relations with India. In fact, the visit of the US President George W. Bush in 2006, which led to the signing of the Indo US nuclear deal, truly signaled the beginning of a strategic partnership with the US. So it was not until 2006 that India and US decided on a path to strategic partnership. Now, in fact, during this era, India was seen negotiating the minds of international politics and dealing with the superpowers and creating a place for itself in the global affairs. Now, relationship with China improved, whereas Japan, South Korea, ASEAN became closer to India. Considering its interest in the West Asian region, India defeatedly managed to maintain its relationship with the Gulf Cooperation Council states like Iran and Israel. Now, during this phase, it successfully managed to balance its equations with different world powers. Now, talking about the last and the most important phase, that is the energetic diplomacy. इससे पहले क्या था? It was balancing power. Now it is energetic diplomacy, the last phase of Indian foreign policy. Now, of course, the contours of this policy are being presently, still developed, and it could only be similar to putting the cart before the horse to judge this policy. Of course, this phase is still very, very in its very, very fragile, phase, and it will only be seen with the due course of time how this phase pans out. But what we have to remember is that with the victory of the Prime Minister Narendra Modi in 2014 general elections, things really have changed in this phase, and in fact, Indian foreign policy is becoming more bold and assertive, and India is working on Atmanirbhar Bharat and is relying less and depending less on external powers for its self growth. In fact, India is on the path of Atmanirbhar Bharat, and it embraces globalization and is standing up against all the illegal practices and especially bullies in the region, for example China, and is standing shoulder to shoulder with the global powers on and is on the verge of energetic diplomacy. Now, of course, India has understood that reactive diplomacy doesn't inspire any confidence and has begun to embrace proactive diplomacy. Now, of course, it is closely related to National Security Advisor Ajit Doval's policy of defensive offense, which aims to tackle the problems at its source rather than waiting for the problem to come to India and then resolving it. Now, of course, this led to the surgical strikes after Uri in 2016 and the Balakot aerial strikes in 2019. Now, of course, the risk-taking appetite of India has also increased in this phase, and it is only going to increase with the kind of developments that are taking place around the globe. Now, in fact, these six phases reflect the the place that that is that India is in international relations, and there are neither. And one thing that, if these phases have taught us, is that there are no permanent friends or enemies, but only national interest that is permanent. There is nothing permanent in Indian foreign diplomacy, but of course, the national interest of a nation. So this was about the 6 phases of Indian foreign diplomacy. I hope you liked the session. If you have, please press the bell icon and press the like button. This is it from my side. Please subscribe to Unacademy if you've not done it already, and use the code PRES10 to get an additional 10% discount. You can also use the Iconic subscription to get a personal coach, a study planner that is customized, that can fine tune your preparations. This is it from my side. See you next time.